Hello again, Dan Alasso here with Chapter 12, or Week 12, of my U.S. History 1 course content. And this one I call King Cotton, Slavery, Annexation. Really, it's the chapter on the 1840s, and the biggest part of the story surrounds those three things. And if I had to put it in just one term, I guess I would say manifest destiny. So let's begin. In the years before the Civil War, American planters in the South continued to grow Chesapeake tobacco and Carolina rice as they had in the colonial era. Cotton, however, had become the antebellum South major commercial crop, and it eclipsed tobacco and rice and sugar in economic importance. By 1860, the region produced 2/3 of the entire world's cotton. And the reason for this growth is that in 1793, Eli Whitney, who you may recall we've already talked about in the context of developing interchangeable parts, Eli Whitney also revolutionized cotton production with the invention of the cotton gin, which dramatically reduced the time that it took to process raw cotton. It was a mechanical way of getting the tiny little seeds out of the cotton boll so that people didn't have to pick the seeds out by hand. As a commodity, of course, cotton also had the advantage of being very easy to store and relatively easy to transport. And demand in the industrial textile mills of first Great Britain and then New England seemed inexhaustible. Almost no cotton had been grown in the United States in 1790, when the first U.S. Census was conducted, and then in 1793, Whitney's invention. And following the War of 1812, cotton became the key cash crop in the Southern economy, and really the most important American export. By 1850, 1.8 million of the 3.2 million enslaved people in the 15 slave states of the South were at work producing cotton. And by 1860, the South produced over 2 billion pounds of cotton annually. American cotton, as I said, already made up 2/3 of the global supply, and production continued to increase. And this is why people like South Carolina Senator James Hammond confidently proclaimed that the North could never threaten the South because, as he said, cotton is king. The cotton crop grown in the South was a hybrid known as Petite Gulf cotton, and it grew extremely well in the Mississippi River Valley, and actually it grew pretty well also in the drier states like Texas, especially along rivers. And whenever new slave states entered the Union, plantation owners began by sending armies of enslaved people to clear land so that they could grow this lucrative crop. The phrase "to be sold down the river," which was used first probably by Harriet Beecher Stowe in her 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, this refers to the forced migration from the upper southern states into the deep South to grow cotton. Thomas Jefferson, you may recall, had this agrarian vision of white yeoman farmers settling the West by single-handedly carving out small, self-sufficient, independent farms. Ironically, this wasn't the case in the Southwest, where Southerners took advantage of his observations that he had made in Notes on the State of Virginia about how Virginians could make money on the quote-unquote natural increase of their enslaved people, even as they had less local work for slaves to do. To ambitious planters, the new land available for cotton production seemed almost limitless. And as we saw last week, removing native peoples from their own homelands opened up over 25 million acres. And this allowed many planters to abandon their fields every 10 to 15 years when the soil became exhausted. Slaves were the vanguard of this American expansion to the West in the South. Cotton planting happened in March and April each year, And then over the next several months, from April to August, the plants had to be carefully tended and the cotton rows weeded. And then beginning in August, all of a plantation's slaves would be called to the fields to work together to pick the crop. Cotton picking occurred as many as 7 times each season, as the plant continued to flower and to produce bolls throughout the fall and the early winter. During the picking season, slaves worked from sunrise to sunset, with a very brief, 10-minute break for lunch. Once they had brought the cotton to the gin house to be weighed, and their day was over, slaves, of course, then had to take care of the animals and perform other chores. Enslaved people often maintained their own gardens and livestock, which they tended after working in the cotton fields, to supplement the relatively meager rations of food that were provided to them by the plantation. As the cotton industry boomed in the South, Mississippi River steamboats became a defining component of the Cotton Kingdom. And of course, they're one of the most enduring symbols of the South. This image is from a documentary from 1937 by Pere Lorentz, who made a lot of documentaries during the Great Depression. And it shows cotton bales being loaded onto a riverboat, as they had been for generations. Riverboats, of course, were an important part of the transportation revolution due to their enormous freight carrying capacity and their ability to navigate in shallow waterways. By 1837, there were about 700 steamships operating on the Mississippi and its tributaries. Major new ports developed at St. Louis and Memphis and Chattanooga and Shreveport, and other locations, in addition to New Orleans. By 1860, 3,500 riverboats were steaming in and out of New Orleans, carrying an annual cargo of cotton worth over $220 million, or about $7 billion in current money. Riverboats also came to symbolize the class and the social distinctions of this age of cotton. While the decks carried the cargo, ornate staterooms were available for white planters, and they socialized in the ship's saloons and dining halls, while enslaved black people served them and watched over their cargoes. New Orleans, of course, had been part of French Louisiana, which the U.S. had purchased in 1803. In the first half of the 19th century, New Orleans rose to even greater prominence with the cotton boom. Steamboats delivered cotton grown on plantations throughout the South to the port at New Orleans. Initially, most American cotton went to Liverpool, England, where it was sold to British textile manufacturers. As New England textile mills overtook the British industry, the South and New Orleans became even richer. And by 1840, New Orleans held 12% of America's total banking capital. And visitors often commented on the great cultural diversity of the city. A visitor from New England wrote, "Truly, does New Orleans represent every other city and nation upon earth? I know of none where is congregated so great a variety of the human species." Slaves, cotton, and the steamship transformed the city from a relatively isolated corner of North America in the 18th century to a thriving metropolis, rivaling New York in importance. The South's dependence on cotton was matched, of course, by its dependence on enslaved people to plant and tend and harvest the crop. Despite the rhetoric of the American Revolution that all men were created equal, slavery, of course, was the foundation of America's system of capitalism, and really the source of its economic success. Importing slaves into the United States, of course, had been outlawed by Congress in 1808, but owning slaves remained legal. At the same time, falling tobacco prices, if you recall, had caused a shift to wheat farming in the Upper South in the early 19th century. Raising wheat was much less intensive of labor than tobacco. In fact, the yeoman farmers that Jefferson had imagined spreading westward grew plenty of wheat with no slaves at all. Rather than competing with farmers in the North and the Midwest, slave owners in states like Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky went into the business of raising and selling slaves to cotton plantations of the Deep South. As many as 1 million slaves were sold down the river in the domestic slave trade during the first half of the 19th century, generating immense fortunes for already wealthy slave owners in the Upper South. During the first half of the 19th century, industrialization had brought changes to both the production and the consumption of goods in the U.S. Some Southerners believed that their reliance on a single cash crop and their use of enslaved people to produce it actually gave the South some type of economic independence and made them immune from the effects of these changes. Actually, producing cotton bound the South even more tightly into the larger American and Atlantic markets. Northern mills depended on the South for supplies of raw cotton. Between 1820 and 1860, about 80% of the global cotton supply was produced in the United States. Before the rise of New England, nearly all of the exported cotton was shipped to Great Britain, making the British Empire increasingly dependent on American cotton and Southern slavery, at least in the minds of Southerners. We'll see in the future how that turned out not to be the case. The power of cotton, though, in the world market may have brought wealth to the South, but it also increased its economic dependence on both other countries and on other regions, other sections of the United States. Much of the corn and the pork that slaves ate came from farms in the New West, what we now call the Midwest. Cheap clothing and shoes worn by slaves were manufactured in the North. The North also supplied all of the furnishings for the homes of both wealthy planters and members of the middle class. Nearly all of the elements of genteel and comfortable Southern living, such as carpets and lamps and dinnerware and upholstered furniture and books and musical instruments, all of these things were made either in the North or in Europe or Great Britain. Southern planters also borrowed money from banks in northern cities. And in the southern summers, many of them took advantage of improvements in transportation to travel to resorts in cooler places like Saratoga, New York, or Litchfield, Connecticut, or Newport, Rhode Island. But things were beginning to change in the North. And these illustrations are a couple of examples. Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, and 12 Years a Slave, published in 1855, had begun changing the minds of Northerners, many of whom up until that time had kind of ignored the problem of Southern slavery. Southern whites promoted the idea of paternalism, claiming that white slaveholders actually were acting in the best interest of the enslaved people, and this was to justify the existence of slavery. Slaveholders claimed to feel great responsibility for the slaves in their care, responsible for their feeding, their discipline, and even their Christian morality, and ultimately the saving of their souls. Some even suggested that their slaves were better off in the South than they had been as savage and heathen free people in Africa. These rationalizations, of course, ignored the realities of slavery, which was dehumanizing, traumatizing, and horrifying for most of the people who experienced it. And slaves were not always the passive victims of their conditions. They often found ways to resist and developed their own communities and cultures. Slaves often, for example, used the notions of paternalism to their advantage. For example, some enslaved people took advantage of slaveholders' racism by hiding their intelligence and pretending to be childish or stupid. Slaves could slow down the workday and could sabotage the system to some extent by accidentally breaking tools. A slaveholder who believed that his slaves were childlike or stupid might conclude that these incidents were accidents rather than resistance or rebellion. Some slaves, of course, engaged in more dramatic forms of resistance, such as poisoning slaveholders slowly. But subversion and sabotage were, of course, dangerous. Some enslaved people, hoping to gain preferential treatment, told the slave owners about resistance, hoping, I suppose, to earn the slaveholders' gratitude and maybe more lenient treatment for themselves. Slave owners, of course, also used both physical and psychological violence to prevent people from disobeying. The lash, whipping, the most common form of punishment, was effective, but sometimes left people incapacitated or even killed them. Slave owners also used punishment gear like neck braces and balls and chains and leg irons and spurs. But often, the most effective way to intimidate enslaved people was to threaten to sell them. Slaves lived in constant fear of both physical violence and also of separation from their friends and family. Under Southern law, slaves couldn't marry, but many slaveholders allowed for unions to promote the birth of children and to keep peace on the plantations. Some even forced slave unions, since more children meant greater profits for them in the future. Slave couples also faced the prospect of being sold away from each other at any time, and once they had children, the threat that their children could be sold and sent away at any time. Slave parents, though, did try to show their children, as long as they had them, how to survive under slavery. They taught them to be discreet, submissive, and guarded around whites. Parents often also taught their children more subversive lessons, sometimes through songs and stories that they told. The most popular stories among enslaved people were tales of tricksters, sly slaves, or animals like Brer Rabbit, who outwitted powerful but stupid antagonists. These stories provided some comfort and humor, and also conveyed the slaves' sense of the wrongs of slavery. And slave work songs commented on the harshness of their life, and oftentimes hid double meanings. A literal meaning that white people, slave owners and overseers, wouldn't find offensive, and then a deeper meaning that was understood only by the enslaved people. Complicating the picture of antebellum Southern society was the existence of a large free black population. More free blacks lived in the South than in the North, about 261,000 before the Civil War in the slave states to only about 226,000 in the northern states. Most free blacks didn't live in the deepest part of the Deep South, but in the upper southern states like Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and later Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, and the District of Columbia. And one reason for the large number of free black people living in slave states were the instances of manumission that had occurred right after the Revolution, when many slaveholders had acted on that ideal that all men are created equal and had freed their slaves. And then the transition in the Upper South from tobacco to wheat, which didn't require large numbers of slaves to produce, also spurred some manumissions from people who didn't take Thomas Jefferson's advice to profit on the increase. And then there was another group of free blacks in the South who had been free residents of Louisiana before the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, and even a few more free black people who had come from Cuba or from Haiti. Most free blacks in the South lived in the cities. Not so many lived on the countryside. But everywhere in the United States, blackness became associated with slavery. Both whites and people of African ancestry were acutely aware of the importance of skin color in social hierarchy. In the South, different terms described a person's distance from full African blackness. And this was similar to the Costa paintings, which I think I showed an example of earlier in the semester when we were talking about Spanish America. Mulattoes had one black parent and one white parent. Quadroons had one black grandparent, and octoroons had one black great-grandparent. And many people, especially people with very little black ancestry, looked pretty much like white people did. But throughout most of American history, there's been a one-drop rule that has prevailed, where a person with even a single African in their background is classified as black, regardless of their appearance. And an obvious example, of course, is Thomas Jefferson's mistress, the enslaved girl, Sally Hemings, who may have looked very much like her half-sister, Jefferson's late wife, Martha, because Sally Hemings was only a quarter African. But that quarter of African blood made her Thomas Jefferson's slave. And in the slave South, even though their legal status was the same, lighter-skinned blacks often looked down on their darker counterparts, which indicates the ways in which both whites and blacks internalized the racism of the time. Of course, enslaved people resisted in small ways every day, but sometimes this resistance led to mass uprisings. Although Southern society tried to hide slave resistance under this fiction of paternalism, which described how happy the slaves were and how much better off they actually were, historians have documented over 250 revolts or plots involving 10 or more slaves, just in North America. Enslaved people understood, of course, that there was no chance of ending slavery through rebellion, as had happened in Haiti, and that any violent resistance would result in massive retaliation. And many, of course, feared the risk that rebelling or resisting would pose to their families. But conditions were often so unbearable that rebellions happened anyway. White slaveholders, outnumbered by slaves in most of the Deep South, constantly feared uprisings and took drastic steps, including torture and mutilation and killing, whenever they believed that rebellions might be simmering. And gripped by this paranoia, whites often imagined revolts to be in the works, even when no uprising was really happening or being planned. Now, of the 250 revolts that historians have found, some of the important ones that happened in the British North American colonies or the U.S. included the New York Slave Revolt of 1712, the Samba Rebellion of 1731, the Stono Rebellion of 1739, which we talked about before, the New York Slave Insurrection in 1741, which wasn't really an insurrection but just was an instance of paranoia, the Mina Conspiracy in 1791, the Point Coupé Conspiracy in 1794, Gabriel's Conspiracy in 1800, the Igbo Landing Mass Suicide in 1803, the Chatham Manna Rebellion in 1805, the German Coast Uprising in 1811, George Boxley's Rebellion in 1815, Denmark Vesey's Conspiracy in 1822, Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, which we'll talk about in a moment, the Black Seminole Rebellion in 1835 to 1838, the Amistad Ship Seizure in 1839, the Creole Ship Rebellion in 1841, the Slave Revolt in the Cherokee Nation in 1842. Remember, I told you that the Cherokee had taken their slaves with them to the Indian reservation that's now Oklahoma. Well, some of those slaves revolted. And then finally, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, which did include an attempt to organize a slave rebellion. Nat Turner's Rebellion, which broke out in August 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, was one of the largest slave uprisings in American history. Nat Turner, like Jemmy in the Stono Rebellion, was a literate slave who was inspired by the evangelism and the Protestant fervor of the Second Great Awakening. After Turner's wife was sold off to another plantation, he began preaching to his fellow slaves, and he gained a reputation among them as a prophet. Turner organized them for a rebellion, which would begin when an eclipse in August signaled them that the time had come. Turner and as many as 70 other slaves attacked slave owners and their families, killing about 65 people, including women and children. Whites responded quickly, and the rebellion was put down in a couple of days. Nat Turner eluded capture until late October, when he was caught and then hanged, beheaded, and quartered. Virginia executed 56 other slaves whom they suspected were part of the rebellion. And white vigilantes murdered over 200 more as panic swept through Virginia and the rest of the South. and Nat Turner's rebellion provoked some heated discussion in Virginia over slavery. The Virginia legislature was already in the process at that time of revising the state constitution, and some delegates proposed an easier manumission process. The rebellion itself, however, made that reform impossible. Virginia and the other slave states recommitted themselves to defending slavery. And the defenders of slavery in the South increasingly blamed Northerners for provoking their slaves to rebel. The South prospered, but its wealth was very unequally distributed. Upward mobility, of course, didn't exist for the millions of enslaved people who produced the foundation of the nation's wealth, but there wasn't much social mobility for whites either, although some poor whites did hope for a day when they might rise enough in the world to own slaves of their own. At least they had that going for them. Because of the cotton boom, there were more millionaires per capita in the Mississippi Valley by 1860 than anywhere else in the U.S. However, in that same year, only 3% of whites owned more than 50 slaves. And 2/3 of all the white households in the South didn't own any slaves at all. Distribution of wealth in the South became much less democratic over time, with fewer whites actually owning slaves in 1860 than had in 1840. At the top of Southern white society was a planter elite, comprised of two groups. In the Upper South, an aristocratic gentry that had existed since before the Revolution, and in the Deep South, a newly rich group of slaveholders who had gained their wealth from cotton. Some members of this new group were from established families in the older states, Virginia and the Carolinas, while others came from humbler backgrounds. South Carolinian Nathaniel Hayward, for example, a wealthy rice planter and a member of the aristocratic gentry, came from a very well-established family. But he also continued to amass an enormous estate. In 1850, he owned more than 1,800 slaves. When he died in 1851, he left an estate worth more than $2 million, or over $65 million in current dollars. And as cotton production increased, wealth flowed to the cotton planters, whether they had inherited fortunes or whether they were part of this newly rich group. And these planters became the staunchest defenders of slavery. And as their wealth grew, they gained political power. Another member of the planter elite was Edward Lloyd V, who came from an established family in Talbot County, Maryland, and became both governor of the state of Maryland and a U.S. senator. His hundreds of slaves formed the most crucial part of his wealth. And like many of the planter elite, Lloyd's plantation was a masterpiece of architecture with park-like lawns and elaborate formal gardens. One of the slaves on Lloyd's plantation was Frederick Douglass, who escaped in 1838 and became an abolitionist leader and writer and statesman and orator in the North. In his autobiography, Douglass described the plantation's elaborate gardens and racehorses, but also its underfed and brutalized slave population. Lloyd employed other whites in Talbot County as overseers and slave breakers, who were entrusted with beating and overworking unruly slaves into submission. Like other members of the planter elite, Lloyd himself served in a variety of local and national political offices. He was a member of the House of Representatives from 1807 to 1809, and then governor of Maryland from 1809 to 1811, and then a senator from 1819 to 1826. And as a representative and a senator, of course, Lloyd had defended slavery in Washington as the foundation of the American economy. As the nation expanded in the 1830s and the 1840s, the writings of abolitionists began to reach a larger national audience, defending slavery, their way of life, and, they believed, their honor. John C. Calhoun became a leading defender of slavery and of the rights of Southerners that he saw as an increasingly embattled minority. His argument of nullification was basically that A majority of a small region, although it might be a minority in the nation, had the power to veto or disallow or nullify legislation put forward by the hostile national majority. Calhoun's theory was reflected one more time before his 1850 death in an essay that he wrote called The Disquisition on Government, in which he once again defined government as a necessary means, in his words, to preserve and protect our race. If government grew hostile to a minority society, then the minority had to take action, including perhaps forming a new government. Disquisition on Government illustrated Southern leaders' growing, intense suspicion of democratic majorities and the danger that they might pass laws that would challenge Southern interests. And white Southerners defended slavery by criticizing wage labor in the North. Along with that argument for paternalism, they argued that the Industrial Revolution had brought about a new type of what they called wage slavery, that they said was far worse than the slave labor that was used on Southern plantations. They claimed, of course, that they paternalistically took care of enslaved people from cradle to grave, and that the freedom of wages in the North meant that poor people were free to starve if they lost their jobs. And defenders of slaveholding also lashed out directly at abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison for daring to call into question their way of life. Virginians actually accused Garrison of instigating Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion. A Virginian named George Fitzhugh defended slavery in his book, The Sociology of the South, or The Failure of a Free Society. Fitzhugh argued that laissez-faire capitalism benefited only the most quick-witted and intelligent, leaving the ignorant at a huge disadvantage. Slaveholders, he argued, took care of the ignorant black people of the South. Southerners provided slaves with care from birth to death, he said, in stark contrast to this wage slavery of the North, where workers were at the mercy of economic forces beyond their control. Ironically, although their claims were insincere, of course, the Southern critique of Northern industrialism wasn't completely baseless. Sometimes even people who are largely wrong aren't completely wrong about everything. And as for William Lloyd Garrison, he founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1831, and then the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. And by 1838, his group had over 250,000 members. Unlike earlier abolitionists, they rejected colonization as a kind of a racist scheme, and they also opposed the use of violence to end slavery. Like Nat Turner, they had been influenced by the evangelical Protestantism of the Second Great Awakening. So Garrison and his fellow abolitionists believed in what they called moral suasion, a technique of appealing to the conscience of the public, and especially to the conscience of the slave owners. Moral suasion relied a great deal on dramatic narratives, often from former slaves like Frederick Douglass, describing how slavery destroyed families as children were sold and taken away from their mothers and fathers. Moral suasion resonated with many Northerners, especially women, who also condemned the sexual violence against slave women and also the victimization of Southern white women by adulterous husbands. Garrison was nearly killed in 1835 when a Boston anti-abolitionist mob beat him and dragged him through the city streets. Anti-abolitionists also tried to pass federal laws that made distributing abolitionist pamphlets a criminal offense. They were afraid that the engravings and the simple language would appeal to people's emotions and might even spark rebellious blacks into action. Their sympathizers in Congress passed a gag rule that forbade the reading of hundreds of petitions that were sent to Washington by abolitionists. A mob in Illinois killed an abolitionist named Elijah Lovejoy in 1837. And the following year, 10,000 protesters destroyed the abolitionists' new Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia, where Angelina Grimke had spoken, burning it to the ground. Many escaped slaves joined the abolitionist movement, including Frederick Douglass. Douglass, as I think I've already mentioned, had been born in Maryland in 1818 and had escaped to New York in 1838. He later moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he lived with his wife. Douglass electrified listeners when he began to do regular public lectures on slavery. He came to the attention of Garrison and others who encouraged him to publish his story. In 1845, Douglass did publish Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, in which he identified by name the whites who had brutalized him. For that reason, along with just the mere act of publishing his story, Douglass had to flee from the United States to avoid being murdered. So he went to London for a couple of years, and British abolitionist friends bought his freedom from the Maryland aristocrat from whom he had escaped. And after living in London for a few years, Douglass returned to the U.S. He began to publish his own abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, in Rochester, New York. And during the 1840s and 1850s, Douglass continued telling the story of his life and highlighting how slavery destroyed families, both black and white. Now, the other major development that I said I was going to talk about today is manifest destiny. And slavery is part of this story as well. There are three basic themes that you might think of as being part of manifest destiny. The first of these relates to the kind of special virtues and qualities of the American people and their institutions. Second is an idea of kind of the mission of the United States to redeem and remake the West, and indeed the entire continent, in the image of this agrarian America. And third is the idea that it is somehow destined, or maybe even divinely ordained, that this is what we're supposed to do. Now, this idea all came together under the term manifest destiny when a newspaper editor named John O'Sullivan, who's credited with coining the term, in 1845, published an unsigned editorial titled Annexation, which may actually have not been written by him, but instead by a journalist and annexation advocate named Jane Casno. And the term kind of captured an idea that we've been talking about all along, really, that goes all the way back to those ideas of providence that were stated by people like John Winthrop and Cotton Mather back in colonial times. And it was picked up by the Democratic Party, especially in the 1840s, to justify a war with Mexico and a negotiation to divide Oregon that we undertook with the United Kingdom. But by 1843, the former U.S. President, John Quincy Adams, who had a very interesting political evolution during his life that took him from being a Federalist in his youth to the Democratic Republicans and ultimately to the Whig Party, by 1843 had become a representative of Massachusetts in Congress and had changed his mind and repudiated manifest destiny because he understood that it meant the expansion of slavery into Texas. Jane Casno was sent by President Polk on a secret peace mission to Mexico in 1845, and she rode to Mexico on horseback and offered to buy Alta California for $25 million. At the outbreak of the Mexican-American War, after the Mexicans refused that offer, she went to the front and she wrote about Winfield Scott's capture of the fortress at Veracruz in March 1847, which made her the first female war correspondent in American history. She helped to negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, and then she worked on business ventures like canal building expeditions and banking projects. After the Mexican-American War, she turned her attention to Cuba, advocating its annexation. In 1845, Texas became a U.S. state, despite having promised Mexico that it would never seek annexation to the United States. It bypassed the regular requirements of being a territory first and accumulating a population of 50,000. And then Texas adopted a constitution that specifically endorsed both slavery and the slave trade, which of course was illegal in the U.S. The United States assumed the territorial claims of the Texas Republic, which included a large disputed territory extending south from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande. President James K. Polk offered to buy the disputed territory, as well as Alta California, for $25 million. But Mexico refused. Polk then moved U.S. troops, led by General, later President, Zachary Taylor, into the area, and the Mexicans attacked the patrol. Blood was shed, and this led to both nations declaring war on each other. The Mexican-American War was almost entirely fought in Mexico. It was really basically a U.S. invasion of Mexico. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who had not been president when the war began, was reelected urgently to lead the nation and the army. The U.S. landed its forces at Veracruz, which was Santa Anna's home, and Winfield Scott took the fortress there, and then they fought their way to Mexico City, just as Cortez had done hundreds of years earlier, which, like Cortez, they conquered and occupied. The 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war and forced Mexico to renounce its claim to not only the Texas territory, but to cede all of its northern territories in exchange for only $15 million in payment for the physical damage caused by the war. In this treaty, Mexico lost half of its national territory, and the U.S. acquired a region that became the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, Utah, Colorado, and parts of Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Now, although most Americans supported the war and believed that it did represent the manifest destiny of the United States to occupy the entire continent, some did oppose it. Abraham Lincoln in Congress asked to see a map showing exactly where the first battles between Zachary Taylor's forces and the Mexicans had been, to try to understand whether, in fact, this had been a defensive action or an invasion. And Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass also wrote against the war. And Henry David Thoreau spent time in jail and wrote his famous essay on the necessity for civil disobedience about his refusal to pay taxes to support the war. Even General and later President Ulysses S. Grant, who had been a lieutenant under General Taylor, recalled years later in his memoirs, quote, "I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies in not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory." Now, of course, Ulysses Grant and Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, all of these people will see each other again in just a few years in the Civil War. But after his experience as a lieutenant in the invasion of Mexico, Grant actually retired from service and went back to civilian life. He won't return to the U.S. Army until 1861. But we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. For now, we've reached the end. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon.